of the CNV conference. And Thomas comes to us from Descon in Germany. But I think his role in this panel is going to be that he actually has the distinction of being an advisor to the HC chairman, which are the HC ISG group that is defining network functions virtualization. So Tom is one of the people who's actually an advisor to that group, and I hope that he'll bring in a perspective, which comes from his consulting as well as his large experience in the HC world. So let's kick it off with a quick preamble. So as the panel is titled, Evolving Towards the Software-Enabled Age. And it's a nice segue from what we just were talking about sort of in the introduction of the talk, which is, it's my understanding that software-enabled solutions are here to stay. I mean, my belief is that software-defined networking, software-defined storage, software-defined compute particularly has been there for a while in the data center, and now they are well established as paradigms for how we might design networks. But the question then becomes is how do carriers move towards that? Not just the data center operators, but really telco carriers. And so the first question that is I'd like to kind of pose to both Thomas and you is, So as I said, the premise is that SDX as a concept is already viable. I mean, it's something that we will definitely have. But then the issue is, how is it going to impact the industry, especially the telco world, and how will it lead to sort of the virtualization of the telco infrastructure? So I'd like to get your sort of thoughts on that, just to kick it off, and then we dive deeper into the issues.
Sounds good. Thank you, Michelle. I guess I'll step back a little bit from that, just to augment some of the comments around operators. So how I view the world, obviously as a society we're becoming highly networked, right? If you think of the power in your pocket of your mobile, stuff like that, so from digital to social to mobile to video to the cloud, that's kind of what's underpinning what's really the driving force behind SDN and NFV. Clearly, over the years, we've seen the status quo it is not going to suffice, right? So now, kind of talking to the impacts at industry level, I would say the very first thing I think that's going to occur, and it's needless to say, is the rate of innovation. I think it has to increase, and I think that's where the resonance of software is key. We talk of the growth of data, so if you take a look at the devices, proliferation of those, and if you take a look at the access rates behind them, so if you take a look at mobile, now we've gone from 2G to 3G, 4G, now LTE Plus is coming, and there'll be 5G coming, stuff like that. So think of the amount of access being through consumerization. What maybe perhaps type of bandwidth available to businesses in the past, they're now available to consumers. Now they're available to every consumer in essence. So I think to match the rate of growth, both not only in the number of endpoints on the internet, but also augmented to that the speeds and the feeds, whether it's to the homes, whether it is to the mobile devices, whether it's to the enterprises and so forth. And through mobilization, essentially we're expecting the same experience regardless of where we are, and independent of location. 1 minute you're in the office, next minute in the car, next minute you're at home. I expect the same behaviors. So really the rate of innovation has to match the advances and the expectations of the consumers and the enterprises. And the nature of the evolution of those services, so at the press of a button, I'm unleashing a whole bunch of things behind the scenes, and that's where cloud has become so powerful. It's transparent to me, I'm just pressing a button, but magic has to happen somewhere, and that's increasingly that's in the cloud. So I think rate of innovation is probably one of the profound impacts on the industry. So I agree that SDN and NFV are given. So then the question becomes, do I ignore it or do I embrace it? And for me, it's simple actually. Yeah, I think if you ignore it at your peril, because if it's a wave, you'll be swept away essentially. The other way to approach it is, it may not be totally clear to you, but certainly if the philosophy of riding the wave, you probably, well, along the way you'll probably make some mistakes, but more than likely, if change is destructive, if you ignore it, you'll probably become irrelevant. So really, there's only one choice, and choice is to embrace it, and then the question becomes how. And I think that's kind of the essence of the rest of the day. Now, in terms of other impacts, when I take a look at the vendor community, it's a good representation here. I look at vendors that are over time probably purely becoming the software vendors. It's an open question for many of you. So certainly, some will do well in providing VNF functions in terms of being part of the NFB ecosystem, probably more commoditized and stuff like that. If you take a look at what's happening, the power of CPU versus ASICs and stuff like that, very interesting story you can do. A lot more these days. And so I think the impact that the vendor community is going to be, for some of you will probably have to make a call. Do you want to be a hardware company? Do you want to be a software company? I think you can probably do both, but increasingly, if historically your business was hardware, you may actually, in many ways, become a software company.
Thomas, thoughts?
You have said a lot of things, and I agree. But I would say in the innovation, the agility is a key area which drives operators, because you cannot do a service introduction and stay around for 9 months, 12 months, or 18 months, dependent. In the meantime, the market has the third generation happening. So operators have to come back to a very agile activity, and this includes everything, unfortunately. It is not only the NFV and SDN, yes, it is important, but it involves technically also what you said, the total operations side. It includes, however, and that's probably even more critical, the total organization of an operator. The silos, which are the biggest obstacle in getting into an agile environment, is basically the biggest hurdle right now. And if you just look at the OSS and BSS parts, these are units which have been by intent not talking to each other over the last 3 decades. They are it's very important for them that they stay independent by themselves. And there's no way to keep that. And major operators have started to change that. And the other point is SDN and the variations of SDN do change with operators NFV SDN interaction. Because, and also the data centers as we know of today, mainly out of the enterprise side, will not be those who are, or which are being used. I think there is the nice word of fog. And fog means the data centers or clouds become very small, and people, well, there's an ETSI initiative for mobile edge computing, which basically looks at base station application layers. And the cloud is probably just the size of my fingernail. That's just the CPU is a little bit around it. So you will face in a big operators environment, like AT&T or Verizon or these sizes, millions of clouds. And they are distributed across the whole environment around the central cloud environment. And of course, this has follow-ups in the link between those multiple clouds at the central arrangement, how you place software functions, not only centrally, but in the merge of all these cloud nodes. So, in addition to what you both said, I think there is tons of things to be done. And they are done, and I have to say, the progress which had been made in the last 18 months, I'm a very impatient man, it's not enough for me, but it has been huge. And the acceptance rate is larger than I feared.
That's good.
But there is a clear distinction between operators who take part of that and not just sitting on the fence and watching how the people are really fighting, but really being in the fight. And they have a good chance to survive. The others, probably we have not talked about. But the same is true for the vendors. And not talking about just for hardware, software change. The vendors have to change in their organization in the same way. Because teams of operators and teams, and these are small teams, empowered small teams, have to work with processes together with the operator small teams. And if you're not able to do that, as vendor, you cannot talk to your operator. So how do you want to do that in business? So it is not only the operators, but they are the forefront to change. It is the whole industry. And this is then the platform, NFV, SDN, for also 5G. And just to give you a few dates, the pre-5G deployments are happening in 2018. We could say more, a few years ahead. But that's damn close. Okay? And operators don't want to go into that adventure without a proven, full, stable, end-to-end operational environment on NFV. This means all people, vendors and the operators, have to get up their sleeves and really take the next 2 years until the end of 16, mid-17, to get really commercial, hard-proven, stable networks on that. And then, in 2018, like South Korea has its Winter Olympics, and this should be run on pre-5G. The FIFA World Cup in Russia should work on pre-5G. There are probably 7 regional pre-5G trials in commercial deployment in 2018. And the Japanese Summer Olympics will have their first pre-5G test network in 2018. So, it is a damned, very tough, very challenging activity, and we all have to make sure that this is happening, and if that happens, I see the operators away from the reducing revenue, fighting for market and all this thing, they are then back on a different road.
So that's excellent. Let me quickly, so there's several important points made here. So one was that you started with the rate of innovation, agility, RAV, which needs to change. I think Thomas supported that. But agility is extremely important. You can't take 18-month cycles to do stuff. And then we talked about Thomas, you introduced the notion of distributed clouds, where the cloud right now it seems to be the big thing, but then in the grand scheme of things with 5G and mobility, the cloud is one. First of all, you have a distributed collection of clouds, and it's a very small piece of the entire sort of network infrastructure puzzle. And that changes several things: the vendor and carrier interdynamics, the dynamics within the carrier, and by extension, the dynamics inside the vendor itself has to change. And then Raj, you pointed out that you have to change. The vendors have to rethink their whole role, whether they're software providers or hardware providers, or where do they fall in between. So those are the things so that's a great sort of segue into how the industry is changing. But then it's a segue into kind of the next thought that comes to mind, which is all right. And Thomas, you kind of laid down the timeline, which is you cannot take 30 years more to change. 5G is coming in 4 years, pre-5G, and so you kind of implicitly put a timeline on how fast this evolution should happen. Now, given that, I guess what one naturally thinks is, what kind of migration plans do the telcos, at least the ones that are really thinking about it, have to moving towards this software-enabled future? How fast are they migrating? What plans do they have? And what are their plans going to look like? So maybe, Rav, and you can talk about the industry in general, you can talk about your specific organizations, and Thomas, of course, what you're seeing in the industry. And in fact, I throw this open also to the people in the audience, because there are members here from different parts of the ecosystem. And once we've heard from the panelists, if you have thoughts on how you think the operator is actually going to get there, what migration plans you're seeing in the industry, we'd love to hear from you as well. So let's start with our panelists.
Yeah, thanks. I think in terms of how to embrace this, whether it's at TELS level, at industry level, the rise of the open network, I think has to be viewed as an opportunity. But I understand the Thomas's comments about we don't have forever to do this. In the face of rising customer expectations, availability, reliability, one of the reasons adoption of the new technologies generally tends to be slow is the fact that you're actually enacting these changes on live networks. As much excitement as there might be at forums like this and the community as a whole, the reality is that I get the excitement and I believe in it, but the reality of delivering on change of this magnitude, it has to be done initially in small steps. You want to implement your simplest of the use cases first, because the very last thing that you want to do in the name of trying to improve the customer experience is actually impact the very same thing. The other fact, I can tell you this based on experience now that we've done POGs and some limited trials, the maturity of the solutions, or I would actually call it immaturity of the solutions, is a major issue. So any of the POGs we've run, there's really nothing that really, right out of the box, that actually works. It requires few software loads. It possibly requires hardware upgrades and stuff like that. I get it, it's a very dynamic story, it's a very dynamic environment, and in many ways we're all in it together. I view suppliers as partners, and it's not a blame game. But that's the reality around the fact that the solutions, which on PowerPoint they look great in terms of concepts, but in reality they are actually far from mature. They're definitely not at a grade that you can actually launch them as a mass-based solution in terms of not without impacting your customer experience. So then really the question becomes, so the concept of the distributed cloud, I think that's a given. Cloud started the way it started, simply made sense from economies of scale. but through proliferation of devices and through, as I alluded to, the end user expectations of, say, certain applications, the latency is a key consideration. So the idea that I have to traverse thousands of miles to go get the piece of content that I want, or if I'm gaming and stuff like that. So the fact that the server resides truly up in the cloud somewhere, I have no idea where it is. So that's kind of driving the kind of the dissemination of that content closer to the edge, whether it's via CDNs, whether it's actually applications on server farms, whether it's you uploading you're backing up your content, whether it's photos, videos, and stuff like that. So I think it's, having been in the industry for 2.5 decades, I always say that the things that took us a decade to get into will probably take us a number of years to get out of it. I wish it, I hope it's not a decade. But I think a powerful anecdote here is the fact that we have a learning, I see Vinny has arrived. Anecdote is the fact that there's a lot of learnings to be had from the over-the-top operators. So a key message from me would be the fact, really, what we're trying to achieve is automation, ultimately, because status quo is not scaling because given the growth that I alluded to. So something has to be done differently. I think that's where software instances of stuff resonates. Creating pools of storage, compute, networking functions. It takes some of the complexity out. I actually do it once for a period of time as opposed to do it for every customer that I have, every instance that I have. Now, my ability to be able to enact that change through software, ultimately, I think it's about automation. I look at Siri as an example, and if I were to contrast this to a telco world, decades ago, think of the number of operators that were employed. And through that stroke of writing that code, it's actually, you basically have an operator on every iOS device. And there's examples on other platforms as well. So I think that's essentially at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to attain. We're trying to attain that level of automation. And I think the learnings have to come from the over-the-top providers. Yes, they started with a clean slate. Their challenge was different. So I think we have to rewrite the processes to match those. I think that's really our challenge.
So maybe I'll throw a question to Vinay just to bring up speed. So what we're talking about here is, it's established that we have to migrate towards the software-enabled future, so-called. And we're trying to understand, what are the, given that we have to do that in some finite time frame, which is not decades, what are the migration plans that the telcos have to moving towards that software-enabled future? And given a lead from RAB, what kind of lessons may they learn from an over-the-top operator like a PayPal or a LinkedIn or Facebook? Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to apologize for coming late to both the panelists to you and the rest of the audience. I got my schedule mixed up and Lauren just called me and got caught up in the traffic, so I apologize. So having said that, so as you know, I've been in the last year's panel too. We have at both eBay and PayPal, we have a consolidated cloud, which is basically just run all our workloads on the cloud. And so we have today around tens of thousands of hypervisors in our cloud, and a lot of the agility has happened because it's taking the operator-centric mindset, changing it to a little bit more software-centric mindset. It will make it happen. And I think in the past I've had some interactions with folks from NFV, like Don Clark, I don't know if he's here today, was with BT, Cable Labs. So we had some interactions with them, and so they were asking, how do we make this thing happen? So what we felt was, instead of trying to boil the ocean, come up with a very simple POC. Make it happen with a small subset. And then figure out what, the business needs of, and the carriers are very different from OTT. We do it because of our reasons. The reason why eBay and PayPal did the cloud was not because of we wanted to sell retail customers that were Amazon, it was for internal needs, for agility and speed and things like that. What used to take weeks and months now takes minutes, hours for us to flex up and flex down. So that kind of thing, I think the way to do that is have a small PLC, have very clear goals for what you want to do, and then make it happen. So and leverage open source very clearly.
Tom, any thoughts?
The migration is a key point. And there had been initially some wild ideas to throw everything and mix everything from the past and the new thing together. These ideas are gone. There's no way to just make a mixture of past and future. I think there is a clear-cut, like you said, simplified approach where you start to leave existing networks unchanged. And you add a new portion for NFV SDN. Of course, the networks have to interact via gateway implementations. The critical point also is the operational side has to interwork. Unfortunately enough, this problem, the latter one, is already working in the industry independent of NFV and SDN. So there is good valid data already there. And with that, you can pick and choose from each of the operators at what speed, at what functionality, with what organization already changed, with what silos still remaining and still improved or disappearing. You have the speed, the stick of the speed in your hand. But this is a baseline of how you do migration. And in addition, I have to say SDN and NFV and the agility and the new software licensing models and things like that has to be decided from a board, the CEO and the managing group within the operator. It cannot grow from somewhere and bloom, then we take the decades. And this has to be clear-cut, down from the top, and that there is no excuse for any CEO or board members or whoever that they never thought about that and they never knew about it. What happened in the past in certain areas? So this has to be very clear and a full commitment, and then changes are speeded up a bit.
Depending on this.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. So let's open it up to the audience. I think this is some great information that was shared. So I'd like to open up to the audience for comments and questions. And there's mics in the back room. So we have a question at the back there. Please introduce yourself and then shoot.
Sunny from Oracle. I work at the CGP in Oracle, in case you're wondering what is this sort of related conversation. So I came in through the K8 acquisition. So strong policy and core IP. So my background is all mobile IP, RAN back in the day. So one of the things that I want to make one comment and raise one issue which I've heard very few people talk about in all these sort of gatherings. The comment is that, especially multi-service operators, one of my experience has been, when I say multi-service operators, I think Rab knows what I'm talking about, the sort of operator that runs both wireline, maybe even multiple flavors of wireline, as also wireless. And typically, it ends up being several flavors of wireless, 2G, 2.5G, 3G. And if it's wireline, it's either a PPF-oriented network or a cable network. And some operators, once again, have all kinds of mixes. What I found is that the organizations that manage these networks tend to be different silos, and getting these organizations to talk to each other and come up with a coherent strategy has been a very big challenge. It's one of the things that I think you alluded to in your slides, Vishal. But so far as the NFV and SDN conversation goes, what I found was there's a lot of confusion, even within silos of the same sort of multi-service operator, which sometimes leads to basically the operator not doing much at all for, in any of these silos. That's one of the concerns that I have, going and talking to customers about some of the initiatives that we have in mind. Of course, I started this conversation long ago with respect to the convergence of the IP network, which is another theme that you alluded to in your slide back, which is also a very big issue before the operator can really, if they want to go towards the timeline proposed by Tom, they need to, converge at the IP layer, the applications a lot quicker than they do the rest of the network. The second part of the story is that, open standards and open source software are being given a lot of thought. And several allusions were made to open source software today. But one of the issues I think operators and vendors are going to have is that, okay, I have a number of developers working on these projects. How am I going to manage the IP and I coming out of these projects, right?
IP as an intellectual property.
Correct, yeah. I've been involved in a standards body which is putting together a sort of team to address some of these issues. I'm not at liberty to talk about which organization yet, but one of the issues that came up constantly was IP management. And it's surprising that most of us didn't have a very clear answer to that. If you look at the regulatory and the IP's ecosystem around us, companies get bought for IP. I mean, it's a non-trivial aspect of our industry. And I'm surprised that not a lot has been thought about or said about IP management.
Yeah, so there are two questions there. One is, what is the story with multi-service operators and silos, and other is, how do we do IP management in an open source world? So I put open to these guys. Just as a data point, by the way, talking of IP, the intellectual assets of the S&P 500 companies, they today constitute about 80% of their value. Just so you know, and Apple is valued at $700 billion, so go figure.
Taking the open source side and IP. Open source, if that is a collaborative open source, this kernel which is being created, it's normally really open source. This means everybody can use it. But as normal, a open source kernel needs to be customized. It needs to be made executable. And there is a so-called channel partner normally assigned to that. And this channel partner makes, dependent on which open source code you do, between 2 and 10 times more money than the revenue of this pure kernel. So it's a very important thing. Now, a lot of IPRs are being created and used by that channel partner, because he creates a lot of testing, implementation, usage, execution area. That's not the traditional IP you maybe had thought of, but it's a very important IP thing. Then the second background of open source is the current SDOs. If you look for 3GPP, they take 10 years to standardize something. This is another nightmare. And it is very clear, and NFV is very, very entrenched in there, that we have to distinguish what are the cornerstone standards, which we still need, and get rid of the other standards in the direction of NFV SDM, and use them via open source, because at the end, if multiple companies work and operators together work on an open source implementation, they create somewhat a standard. They don't name it right now standard, but it is a de facto standard. And this comes then in maybe half a year. Big change. And with that, IPRs are, and I don't say that is finished now, it's ongoing in the process, but people are thinking and working very intensively on that in order to have a validation and a value still in IPRs, but that they are still availably assigned to a company, but this cannot be directly in the open source code. So there has to be a link.
Yeah,
You should be
as I
having the one.
kind of want to make a statement about open source. So I made a statement earlier that leverage open source where you can. So that may not work for everyone, but not all companies. Like, classic examples, Google and Facebook, and they leverage a lot of open source and they give back a lot of the code out. So having said that, there are, I feel, the main point of open source, at least from my viewpoint, a lot of the OTT vendors would be, it is a freedom from product roadmaps. They're generic, right? So you could still charge, like, if you look at the Red Hat model, or like the OpenStack, there are several distributions that are coming out. The code is still open source, but you can have a bundle around it that you can sell a service around it. You can still do that. But what open source gives you is, if you have the capabilities or the manpower to go make the changes to, one product doesn't fit all use cases, but if you want to make any changes, you can do it. So there are some companies which like to have that freedom, and I think that's what gives you utility, right? Because you can't just act like 6-month, 1-year roadmaps for us for feature requests have to wait for 6 years. So if you look at the white box vendors, right, one classic example, if you see more and more vendors, they were initially saying, well, there's no value, it's not going to be supported, but you see more and more announcements coming out, they're supporting them. It's a classic example. So you take a Linux, like Cumulus does that, they provide the Linux operating system. And one of the main reasons is the feature. So I want to add a monitoring tool to that. I can't wait for the vendor to, I'm one of the customers for the vendor. And my priority would be like at the bottom somewhere. So on the other hand, give me the open source. I will take the risk associated with making the changes. Put in my own monitoring code on that. So this is what I mean by leveraging the open source. It doesn't mean that you can't make money off of it. There are ways, and companies have shown that they can do that.
I guess I'll make two comments to Sonny's question. One is, I think the question of IP, I kind of view it as a two-tier system that's kind of approach, and we're going towards. One is there's kind of the team of rivals that's coming up with a framework. Yeah, that's somewhat shared, or it's kind of some of the value of that resides within the standards bodies. But then there's an augmentation to that, actually, of the solutions themselves, or the services, as many call them. So I think framework is simply because you open to something that's open. So there's the closed versus open, and there's open versus open source, right? The fact that your solution is open in the sense you've written some API somebody could write on top of it, to me that's not really open. Yeah, to some degree it's open, but to have something that's open source, I think ultimately that's what we're striving for. That doesn't mean that you cannot have your own intellectual property on top of that, of your differentiators, right? That's the first one. And the second one, on your point of, Thomas has mentioned silos a couple of times. You mentioned about some of the challenges that our industry has. I agree with them. I mean, your opening remarks were around them in terms of it's the business that needs the transform, right? So I think how it's going to happen, or should happen, at least there are examples out in the industry of successful carriers who are doing that.
Dallas right there is one such, right?
Thank you.
It began 10 years ago.
Yeah. So rather than try to innovate through business as usual, and you really have to kind of rewrite the processes for the next generation, for the next age, stuff like that. And that's how we've embraced it. We've embraced convergence all the way from core all the way to the edge. And when I talk about convergence, I mean everything. From our cell sites to the homes to the businesses, there is truly converged. It's IPM is right to the edge. So we've actually, it's been slower than I'd like for it to be, but we have accomplished it.
And you actually merged your organizations too along the way, right? Wireless and then IT and ops.
Actually, I was going to speak to that. So the technology is actually an enabler for you to wrap the organization around it. So the culture then comes around the fact that technology, if you embrace technology as the enabling piece, then the organizational piece has to follow. If you try to do next-gen technologies, so if I were to do a Venn diagram, so it's basically next-gen technologies, it's next-gen processes, next-gen workforce, it's next-gen skills, essentially. It's really that you create a sweet spot, and that's how it has to be done. So really, for any telco to succeed in a big way with NFV and SDN innovation, if you're trying to do it through the shops that exist that deliver your solutions today, I think you're missing the point. You have, because they have a full-time job, on top of that, they're encumbered with this. So really, you ought to have a small group of guys who are not thinking through a telco process, who are simply innovating. They don't have the shackles of that process. And at the end, what worked, that is the process. Write it up and then move on.
That's really great. So let's, more questions from the audience. We have some more time, so let's take a few more questions. We need some mics up here.
Thank you. My name is Levi Cohen. I'm from Amdocs. And I would like, Vinay, if you can more elaborate about what you do with SDN and about specific examples. I mean, I understood you have 10,000 of hypervisors and so on, and it would be very great if you can elaborate more about what you do, particularly with SDN.
So SDN, first definition from the way I'd like to see SDN is anything that relates to layer 3 connectivity, we like to, at least within our organization, we like to call it SDN. NFV, my point, is like anything which goes on top of load balancers, like load balancers, firewalls, things like that. They fall into the NFV category. So for us, the SDN is not an end goal, it's a means to an end. And our end goal is software-defined data center. Because within our software-defined data centers, we have compute, storage, networking, load balancers, firewalls. All of them need to be automated. And when you're trying to do things at scale, like for example, there was an incident, let's say for example, passwords got breached, we need to reset the passwords. So now I need to expand the pool of applications which are responsible for changing the password, fix it up. I just cannot make an announcement and everybody logs in and changes their password, and I don't have capacity. So in the past, and I say past, I'm talking several years ago, 3-4 years ago, it would have taken us weeks, months to fix up the capacity. Now it's a matter of hours. And so that is where so going a little bit more specific into what we use SDN for, we use it for automation. So if you have a network element that you can manage through APIs and integrate it into your cloud management system, that's what I would like to call from the definition that we use, that's SDN. So that could be used for overlays or under physically bridged VMs. That's a separate issue. But what we do is we have programmatic network hash points. And what we find that is like today, we went with the model where we use a soft switch within our hypervisors. There's Open vSwitch, which is part of the Linux kernel, that sits there. That has a awesome programmability, which we lack in the top of the rack switches and the distribution switches, spine switches. So if you want to create any overlays or anything like that, the best way to do that is directly touch your hypervisors. So now what happens is, instead of having one top of the rack switch for each rack, you have 48 to 50 switches per rack. So you're distributing the functionality of the switch itself in the software element. So when we talk about SDN, that's what we're talking about.
Excellent. You have another question?
Yes. My name is David Podolski from Amdocs. I work in OSS. The question should be for Robin. You talk about POCs, how to test before you are going to production. And my question would be, what would you recommend for others that are less advanced? Would you go for a function that is a virtual CPE, which is very exposed into your customers, or for something that is more internal to the service provider, like a router that is an internet gateway or something more in IMS. If you can share your experience or how you approach that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's certainly a challenge because the list of use cases across the organization, there's no lack of them. Let's put it that way. One of the very first things I would look at is actually kind of a collaboration amongst across the organization. So if you have 5 different groups scattered over different business units, and they're trying to come up with their own SDN or NFV solution, then I think my argument would be you're missing the point. If you're going to come up with 5 different solutions, then it's a non-starter because half your benefits are washed away. It's kind of the old silo mentality versus kind of the next gen approach to it. The second one would be, so if you had a common framework, what does that look like? Define it, and then define what are your requirements in terms of capacities, locations, site redundancy, and so forth. Then overlay on top of that all the different use cases. So if I had 5 different stakeholders, maybe I might invite, okay, what is your number 1 priority? And then certainly you can do that at different locations. We have multiple centers of excellence. So we have a wireline-centric, wireless-centric, so we can do multiple at the same time. But they're part of a plan. They're part of a larger approach that hopefully is moving in unison. So that's the approach we're working with, and that's the one I would advise of. So if you've got scattered activities, overlapping possibly, or redundant, and you're stepping on each other's toes, and you're going to miss a huge amount of benefits. So I would say coordinate it, line it up. If you have 100 use cases, have 100 use cases, but you can only probably tackle realistically 10. What are your top 10 out of those 100? And my argument internally would be to go with the simplest ones, build up your confidence, make sure that you know you actually understand beyond hype what these terms are, and understand them, build your confidence, and then move from there.
So we're going to be wrapping it up in a few minutes, so I just wanted to see if there are any other thoughts or questions from the audience for any of our panelists. Okay, we have one there. Is mine coming up?
Hello, I'm Mark from NoviFlow. You mentioned a lot about having solutions that are coming from open software sources and so on. From a total solution perspective, how much do you want to see a solution completely implemented by a specific vendor? Are you willing to do the integration level, to use the open source software with the vendor's equipment to build a solution? Or do you prefer to use an integrator who will have, let's say, the chops and the experience with SDN to do this?
I think the NFV group has founded a OP-NFV, Open Project NFV, and this is specifically for integration of open source solutions. This means it is fairly clear that there would be not only one project for open source, but they have to interwork and they have to be integrated. So this open source group, OP-NFV, is just for that purpose. But it is clear that the tendency would be that open source would grow. The ideal people, they talk about the Pareto principle of 80-20, which I don't share, but you can talk about numbers. But today, even in the last, I would say, half a year, there is a big move of open source coming in, and that's not necessarily bad. And to say that very pointed here, I have seen from between 5 and 10 operators business cases where they compared a fully existing boxed, vertically integrated solution, and at the end with open source implementation as much as possible. However, also with the channel partner approach, adding services to the open source, yes, the revenue was slightly smaller, but not a factor, but the margin was extremely higher. So if you, and that's my plaidoyer, get up to the open source. Be not defensive and that's the devil and whatever. Take it as an element and make use out of it and act on it appropriately. And then you will see that a lot of things you fear today, or some of the industry players here today, will move into a different atmosphere.
And just a short answer to your question. I think there's room for integrators in our industry. So I think the Googles and Facebooks, they're software shops inherently. They probably approach this differently, but I think telco, because historically, software isn't our thing, historically at least, right? So I think there's room, but ultimately it'll be measured against what is the value, what's your value prop, what are you adding, right?
Yeah. So one of the very widely used cloud management systems is OpenStack. This has gotten a lot of traction. So we use OpenStack in our cloud. And it's very, it has got a lot of components. It seems like it's scattered. But in the last 2 years that we've seen, it has every release, they do like a very great job of releasing a new release every 6 months. And they have large summits. You can go submit your proposal, write code, submit it. So it's all open. And it has been a challenge. It is challenging to put all these components together and orchestrate your cloud management system, but it is getting easier. So there are some vendors. In our past, we did leverage some other vendors to help us out, bootstrap, but now it's all internally run. But again, one thing I would say, like, going back to what you were saying, there is perhaps a difference between some OTT vendors which embrace software because they're software-centric point of view versus some traditional telcos which may not have that. But what I would say, like in this age, and I think we have to embrace, everything is getting virtualized. You have components lying all over the place, and we're talking large scale. And building 5.9 equipment is great, but you can achieve a lot of resiliency and flexibility by putting the resiliency in the software to do that. So that is the model that we need to go towards. So I think, so instead of like trying to write everything from scratch, if you can leverage some of the open source, do that. So maybe that mind shift needs to happen.
But then the bottom line is that there is a role apparently for integrators. And going back to what Tom was saying and bringing it full circle, I mean, starting with the IAM, intellectual property question. I mean, it is the role of the integrator to A, do the specific things that the operator is asking for, and in that process maybe generate intellectual property that is valuable for either the ecosystem as a whole or the integrator or whatever, and create more value, beyond what the core framework which Raf talked about is provided. So I think that is what we have time for today. I would like to thank the panelists for sharing some excellent insights. It's so great to move to the software-enabled age, and I think we'll take a break till 11 o'clock and we'll be back with the next panel that will be shared by Ed Schneider. So we'll see you then.